So, a very good evening to all of you present here. I, Dr. Krishna Sinhamahapatra, welcome you to the 5th lecture in the lecture series of literary criticism. So, we have already had 4 lectures on this topic, and now we are almost towards the end of it, wherein we have discussed how it originated and the different phases through which it has developed, right? So, lecture 5 will start from where we had stopped in the previous lecture, that is lecture number 4. So herein we are going to talk about the Victorian critics of literary criticism. So Victorian critics, and I had just discussed in brief who we are going to start with and how Victorian critics have now progressed from the Romantic age critics and in certain new aspects of criticism, which we are going to discuss. So the first Victorian critic whom we are going to discuss is George Eliot. So, George Eliot was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. So those who are reading, and all of you are actually reading for net set. So as a writer also, all these critics whose names I am taking, be it the Romantic critics whom we have discussed in the previous lecture, or the critic whom we are discussing today, the Victorian critic, all of them are really important writers. So their contribution as significant writers, poets, and novelists and dramatists, I'm talking about the different writers, of each one of them is significant. So it's the thing is that, you know, it's not that they have just been the kind of critics as we are discussing them, but their impact is much more. So whenever we are taking these names, it is understood that as students of net set examination, you will be preparing them as writers as well, so that the important writers can be covered while you are preparing, right? Now, Eliot's realism is the most important thing and the significant thing, and that is the reason why we are going to start with Eliot's realism. We discussed this in the previous lecture as well, that we are going to briefly discuss about it. So George Eliot, as we said, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, he was a Victorian novelist. So as I was saying, each of the writers, if somebody is a good poet, somebody is a good novelist, so what are their novels, what are their, if he or she is a poet, then what are their important poems and what kind of poems they were writing? You need to take a look at that as well. So Eliot was a Victorian novelist, and she also had a career in journalism. So besides working for the journal, the Westminster Review, she also wrote some poetry. She is, however, mainly remembered for her novels. She is associated with the movement of literary realism. Now, since she is associated with the movement of literary realism, we are specifically talking or having a session on her realism. Her essays, Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, and a chapter in her new novel, Adam Bede, explain Eliot's brand of realism. So, her essay and her novel, Adam Bede, explain her brand of realism, that what kind of realism she was talking about. The social and political life of provincial England found place in the works of Eliot. So, social and political life of provincial England found place in the works of George Eliot. She began with Adam Bede, And her very first novel contained an ordinary carpenter as the eponymous hero. So, as the name of the novel suggests, the it was about a particular character, an ordinary carpenter, and it was named Adam Bede. So this was a classic example of an ordinary character in a realist novel. So instead of coming up with any imaginary figure or the imaginary character, here is actually doing what he is, rather she is doing what she is creating a particular character which is realistic, something which we can see every time around us. For example, the character of a carpenter. So a realist should not attempt to present characters as flawless and should not try to straighten their noses, brighten their wit, or rectify their dispositions. What do you mean by this is that, so usually if it's a heroic piece, or if it is a fantasy novel, you will see that some kind of characters which are created, they are created in such a way that they are not lifelike. That is why you will see that the heroines of these novels are projected as extremely beautiful, like somebody with a straightened nose, brightening their wit, somebody very witty, very clever, and the activities which they do, they are rectified, so a better image is presented. So it's just like our profile pictures, and in social media, the kind of pictures which you put up, which is the kind of perfect version of the life which you are leading. Usually you are not going to put up a picture which is not very impressive, or something which is, you have kind of worked on it and have tried to create a good image of yourself. Usually people don't put, usually I'm saying, not for everyone, but usually people don't like to put things which are not that good on the social media in order to create an image of themselves as very happy, very beautiful, very, kind of knowledgeable, and having a very good life, right? So it is exactly how it is basically not exactly the way things are in reality, right? You are creating a picture. So that is exactly what, Eliot was against. She was against the fashion of creating any kind of imaginary character. What she wanted was to put in original characters with all their flaws, with all their problems before the audience. Why? Because she believed that humans in real are imperfect, and literature should depict them as such. So literature should depict them as such, because humans in real are imperfect. And when literature is a reflection of reality, then literature should depict these characters. Which characters? The humans who are actually imperfect, because everybody is a real human being. We are not robots. We are not any fictional character from any novel. We are real flesh and blood human beings, and hence we should have a real depiction of herself, right? So similarly, the eponymous protagonist of her 1861 novel, Silas Marner, and that character was a weaver. So we see, if some place you are seeing an ordinary carpenter, then in other place you are seeing a weaver. So not a very fantasy, a character from a fantasy book, not any imaginary character, but a real flesh and blood human being who is doing some real work, is not just a prince or princess of some kingdom, but the activities which we keep on doing for ourselves to be alive, so in some profession. So these characters also resemble the same. So Adam Bede, third volume, her first long novel, she described as a country story full of the breath of cows and the scent of hay. Its masterly realism, the faithful representing of commonplace things, brought to English fiction the same truthful observation of minute detail that John Ruskin was commending in the Pre-Raphaelites. So, the faithful representing of commonplace things brought to English fiction the same truthful observation of minute detail that John Ruskin was commending in it, right? In the pre-Raphaelites. So, Ruskin was commending the such kind of expressions in the pre-Raphaelites. And the book is rich in humor. Then the germ of the plot was, rather, it will be the gem of the plot was an anecdote from her Methodist aunt told of visiting a girl condemned for child murder. The dialogue, the dialect, the way they were speaking of the beads, she had heard in the conversations of her Derbyshire uncles with her father, some of whose early experiences she assigned to Adam. But what was new in English fiction was the combination of deep human sympathy and rigorous moral judgment. So there was a combination of deep human sympathy and rigorous moral judgment, right? This is what was new. It's an early example of realism for which George Eliot became celebrated. The exact meaning of realism, however, has been much debated. So it's not a very simple word, that it has got its own expressions, its own significations or significance. So in an essay on the artist and critic John Ruskin, Eliot herself defined realism as the doctrine that all truth and beauty are to be attained by a humble and faithful study of nature. So, Eliot herself defined realism as the doctrine that all truth and beauty are to be attained by a humble and faithful study of nature. To her, realism did not mean a naive belief that writing can transparently represent the real world, but the conviction that she was very sure, what was she sure of? That writing should not falsify or romanticize it. So it was her strong belief that writing should not romanticize or falsify, that is, create a false impression of reality. Eliot regarded realism as a moral choice as well as an aesthetic one. As she explains in her essay, The Natural History of German Life, art is the nearest thing to life. It is a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot. So, what is she saying? Art is the nearest thing to life. So, if something can be very near to life, then it is art. So during that time, painting was there. Photography was not in fashion the way we see it now. So the only form of art which is very near to reality, so something which is near to reality is nothing but art. It is a mode of what? Mode of amplifying experience. That is kind of giving some impetus to experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot. This newer conception is expressed in both the form and content of Adam Bede. That is the idea of realism. One of the features of this novel is that its narrative is self-conscious, with the omniscient narrator, who is always present, after pausing to reflect on the story and to mediate between the story and the reader. So this is what the omniscient narrator is trying to do. So, reflect on the story and mediate between the story and the reader. The most, that is, being the mediator, being the in between person, between whom? Between the story and the reader. The most striking example of this occurs in chapter 17, entitled In Which the Story Pauses a Little. So, what is it entitled? It's entitled as In Which the Story Pauses a Little. Eliot uses this chapter to outline and justify her narrative technique of realism. So, the narrative technique of realism is justified and outlined in this chapter. She imagines the reader exclaiming that her portrayal of a certain character called Mr. Irwin, rector of Broxton, presents him as little better than a pagan. She retorts that as a novelist, she wishes to avoid refashioning life and character after her own liking. Rather, she says, my strongest effort is to avoid any such arbitrary picture. So, as we have discussed, various writers and various, people around us, you will see that, if you see somebody writing, it's always what happens is that their views, their wishes, their desire of portraying a picture. For example, you are writing a poem, you are writing a novel, rather. Instead of composing a poem, you're writing a novel and you're creating a character, right? Now, that character which you have created is a product of your imagination. And when you're imagining and creating a product, then what happens is that you have your own views projected in it, right? However, what we see that Eliot is saying is that she wishes to avoid what? Refashioning life and character after her own liking. So she doesn't want to refashion her life and character after her own liking. Rather, she says that my strongest effort is to avoid any such arbitrary picture and to give a faithful account of men and things as they have mirrored themselves in my mind. So she is saying that I don't want to paint any picture. I don't want to put any new color to it. What exactly I have seen, what is there in my mind, exactly that I'm going to put into the paper. I'm not going to exercise some of my imaginary powers to kind of add any color to what I am trying to say. As the first principle of a realism is the artistic pursuit of truth. She wanted to present things which are truthful. Her artistic pursuit of truth. And what kind of truth? A truth which is based on direct experience of the world. So this truth is again not a fabricated truth, my own truth, but that truth is actually based on direct experience of the world. So the artist the difficulty of such an enterprise. Falsehood is so easy, truth so difficult. Examine your words well, and you will find that even when feelings. Now, this is a very, very profound truth. And what she is trying to say is that it is very difficult to say what is true. You have gone to a party and then you come back from the party and your mother says, hi, dear son and daughter. It might be Rahul, it might be Rashmi. Can you please tell me what did you see in the party? आपने पार्टी में क्या देखा? क्या क्या हुआ था पार्टी में? Now, when you are actually telling about these things, these details about the party to your own mother, you will see that you will not be able to say the exact truth. Certain things you will forget. Certain things, as you are saying, will not be the exact version of the truth which you have seen. Major chunk will be the truth because you want to tell the truth. But even then, there will be some words, certain expressions, certain viewpoints which perhaps won't be exactly how it had happened. That is why falsehood is so easy. If you have to tell a lie, it's so easy to tell a lie. You just make up things in your mind and you create that idea and you share that idea with people. But when you have to tell the exact truth, then it becomes difficult for you to even understand whether you're telling the exact truth. Because even through our endeavor of speaking the truth, there might be instances wherein we won't be able to speak the exact truth. And that is exactly what Eliot is trying to say. She is saying that it is really the difficult enterprise to speak the truth. So, the first principle of her realism is that the artistic pursuit of truth is what she is seeking for. Knowing very well how falsehood, that is speaking something wrong, is easy and truth is so difficult. So, examine your words well, and you will find that even when you have no motive to be false, even when you want to speak the truth, there are situations wherein you do not speak the truth. The second principle of a realism, which follows from the pursuit of truth, is experience is complex and must not be reduced to expression in preconceived categories. The representation of experience must be authentic, refusing to pander to current prejudices and popular taste. So, preconceived categories, this expression is important. What happens? Many times we have certain preconceived notions about people. If you have read the novel Pride and Prejudice, you will, the idea of prejudice which is there, wherein you have prejudice regarding certain things. You think that this thing is not going to be good or this is not going to be the exact truth. So before going to a book fair, you are thinking that, oh no, the book fair won't be good, it won't be fun, there won't be enough options. So we are having certain preconceived categories or certain preconceived notions in our mind. So the principle of realism, the second principle is that experience is complex and it must not be reduced to expression in preconceived categories. So any kind of experience is not really easy. It is really complex. There are different shades to it. But you need to actually experience that. Before experiencing that, you should not reduce the expression in preconceived categories. The third principle of the realism advocated by Eliot is its moral basis. So she is talking about the moral basis. We should accept people in their actual imperfect state rather than holding them up to impossible ideals. So we should accept people in their actual imperfect state rather than holding them up to impossible ideals. These fellow mortals, everyone, must be accepted as they are. You can neither straighten their noses, nor brighten their wheat, nor rectify their disposition, that is, change what they are doing or where they are. It is these people amongst whom your life is passed that it is needful you should tolerate, pity, and love. So the virtues or the values of tolerate, pity, and love is evoked here. That it is needed to tolerate, to have pity and love. right? So, Eliot, uh, as we are talking about George Eliot, that she is talking about the moral basis and how we should actually accept people in their actual imperfect state rather than having any impossible ideals or ambitions in our mind. We should exercise, tolerate, or exercise our power to tolerate, to have pity, and to love. And love and tolerate people who are imperfect. Instead of trying to make them and project them as perfect, try to project them as imperfect. The fourth principle of realism for Eliot is given in her view of beauty. She effectively redefines, or at least vastly extends, the medieval conception of beauty as pertaining to the form and proportion of an object. So she effectively redefines, or at least vastly extends, what? The medieval conception of beauty as pertaining to the form and proportion of an object. Hence, the obligation of the artist to truth also becomes an obligation to beauty in this revised sense, an obligation to sympathize with and perceive the beauty in ordinary things and events. Right? So, the fourth principle of realism for Eliot, what is it? Is given in her view of beauty. She effectively redefines, or at least vastly extends, the medieval conception of beauty as pertaining to the form and proportion of an object. Hence, the obligation or a kind of duty of the artist to truth also becomes an obligation to beauty in this revised sense, an obligation to sympathize with and perceive the beauty in ordinary things and events. So, you have to see the beauty in the ordinary things which are happening around you, and project it accordingly. So, through these discussions, we kind of uh, got an idea of what kind of realism Eliot was talking about and how she felt that realism is very essential, and human beings, human characters need to be projected with all their flaws exactly as they are in real life. And she wanted to state that when we are doing it, there should be some kind of attempt to look into the beauty which is existing in things around us and try to uphold that beauty. Next is Friedrich Nietzsche or Nietzsche. So, Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844, and you must have heard about his name, and you might have even come across some of his works. So, he actually was a German classical scholar, a philosopher, critic of culture, who became one of the most influential of all modern thinkers. So, Friedrich Nietzsche or Friedrich Nietzsche was a German classical scholar, philosopher, and critic of culture. His attempts to unmask the motives that underlie traditional Western religion, morality, and philosophy deeply affected generations of theologians, philosophers, psychologists, poets, novelists, and playwrights. So he was not only a mere writer, but what happened is that he has actually an influencer, influenced so many different people, and be it from theology, people from philosophy, people from psychology, poets, novelists, and playwright through his contribution. So Nietzsche's writings fall into three well-defined periods. What are the periods? The early works, which is the birth of tragedy, and the four untimely meditations, are dominated by a romantic perspective influenced by Schopenhauer and Wagner. The middle period, from human all to human up to gay science or the gay science, reflects the tradition of French aphorists or French thinkers. It extols reason and science, experiments with literary genres, and expresses Nietzsche's emancipation from his earlier romanticism and from Schopenhauer and Wagner. So there is a kind of transformation which we are actually seeing, wherein there was early romantic influence, and slowly he moved across or moved ahead of this kind of influence which he had in his mind. So Nietzsche's mature philosophy emerged after the gay science. So slowly the early works, middle works, and then the matured work or matured philosophy of Friedrich. Now we are moving to his mature writings. So the mature writings of Nietzsche was preoccupied by the origin and function of values in human life. So, what were the mature writings doing? Mature writing was preoccupied by the origin and function of values in human life. As we saw that there was a constant progression from his initial days when he was actually kind of influenced by now, if as he believed, life neither possesses nor lacks intrinsic value, yet is always being evaluated, then such evaluations can usefully be read as symptoms of the condition of the evaluator. So, he was specially interested, therefore, in a probing analysis and evaluation of the fundamental cultural values of Western philosophy, religion, and morality, which he characterized as expressions of the ascetic ideal. So, the main idea over here is that he was preoccupied by the origin and function of the values in human life. And he believed life neither possesses nor lacks what? Intrinsic value. So, you need to look at the intrinsic value and try to probe that. And so in a probing analysis and evaluation of the fundamental cultural values of Western philosophy, religion, and morality, which he characterized as the expressions of the ascetic ideal. So finally talking about the values and trying to probe into the depth of values. The ascetic ideal, that is talking about freeing yourself from any physical pleasures, is born when suffering becomes endowed with ultimate significance. So, according to Nietzsche, the Judean or Judeo Christian tradition, for example, made suffering tolerable by interpreting it as God's intention and as an occasion for atonement. Christianity, accordingly, owed its triumph to the flattering doctrine of personal immortality, that is, to concede that each individual's life and death have cosmic significance. So, by making it feel that there is some kind of intention of God, what happened is that they tried to make some a person believe that suffering is fine. Similarly, traditional philosophy expressed the ascetic ideal when it privileged soul over body, mind over senses, duty over desire, reality over appearance, the timeless over the temporal. While Christianity promised salvation, that is a kind of reward for the sinner who repents, philosophy held out hope for salvation, although secular for its sages. So, for philosophy, in case of philosophy, it was the sages who were given some kind of salvation. Now, common to traditional religion and philosophy was the unstated but powerful motivating assumption that existence requires explanation, justification, or expiation. Both denigrated experience in favor of some other true world. Both may be read as symptoms of declining life or life in distress. Now, this term nihilism is important, was a term Nietzsche used to describe the devaluation of the highest values posited by the ascetic ideal. So, devaluation of the highest values which were posited by the ascetic ideal. He thought of the age in which he lived as one of the passive nihilism, that is, an age that was not yet aware that religious and philosophical absolutes had dissolved in the emergence of the 19th century positivism. With the collapse of metaphysical and theological foundations and sanctions for traditional morality, only a pervasive sense of purposelessness and meaninglessness would remain. And the triumph of meaninglessness is the triumph of nihilism, which stands for the idea that God is dead. Nietzsche thought, however, what did he think? That most people could not accept the eclipse of the ascetic ideal and the intrinsic meaninglessness of existence, but would seek supplanting absolutes to invest life with meaning. So, Nietzsche often thought of his writings as struggles with nihilism, and apart from his critiques of religion, philosophy, and morality, he developed original theses that have commanded attention, especially perspectivism, the will to power, eternal resurgence, and the Superman. So, we had a discussion on what is the idea of nihilism and how this idea was projected by the thinker we discussed. This brings us to the next thinker, which is G.M. Hopkins. So you must have read quite a few poems of Hopkins, which might have been there in your syllabus. So this is Gerard Manley Hopkins' term for which term? The term sprung rhythm. So the main idea which we need to discuss from Gerard Manley Hopkins is his idea of sprung rhythm. So sprung rhythm, for his most characteristic and idiosyncratic poetic mode. So, most characteristic and idiosyncratic poetic mode. Hopkins seemed to define it as organizing lines around stressed syllables. So organizing lines around stressed syllables. In sprung, so stressed, the way when we are speaking, when we are reciting a line, we put stress in some place and we don't put have unstressed spaces in some places. When we are putting stress, this kind of a line we draw on top of that particular letter. For example, if we have to give stress on Hopkins, we will be kind of giving the stress line somewhere here. So Hopkins, or the way we are putting stress. So he is saying that his sprung rhythm was actually about organizing lines around stressed syllables. So in sprung rhythm, the poetic foot always starts on a stressed syllable and maybe 1 to 4 syllables long. Other unstressed or slack syllables may also cluster around the strongly stressed ones, but it is only stress that counts. The most important consequence of this theory for Hopkins' own poetry was his feel for a poetic foot that might be a single syllable long. No alteration of any sort is required between stressed and unstressed syllables. So he felt that no alteration of any kind is needed between the stressed and the unstressed, as would be required in what Hopkins called running meter. That is the received iambic and sometimes trochaic meter of English poetry. So when you are reading meter of poetry, you will see that in some cases it starts with stress, then one term is used. If it ends with stress, another term is used. However, the rhythm which G.M. Hopkins propagated was sprung rhythm, which was organized around, or it was about organizing lines around stressed syllables. In his 1877 letter to Bridges, Hopkins asked, "Why do I employ sprung rhythm at all?" And the answer is because it is nearest to the rhythm of prose, the least forced, the most rhetorical and emphatic of all possible rhythms. So, the reason why this kind of rhythm was used is that because it is nearest to the rhythm of prose and the least forced, the most rhetorical and emphatic of all possible rhythms. So, we discussed the main idea of sprung rhythm of G.M. Hopkins, wherein Hopkins was trying to create a new rhythm, which is sprung rhythm, which was about organizing lines and by what? Or keeping in mind what? Keeping in mind the stressed syllables. Now, this brings us to the next critic, the next Victorian critic, which is Henry James. In his essay, The Art of Fiction, that James most succinctly expressed his critical principles as well as a justification of his novelistic endeavor. So, what did he express? He expressed his critical principles as well as justification of his novelistic endeavor. So, what kind of endeavor or what kind of ambition he had while writing novels is given in his essay, The Art of Fiction, because fiction usually refers to the art of storytelling in the form of novels. So, the motivation of this essay is threefold. That is, there are three main motivations of his essay. Firstly, he is combating what it takes to be general reluctance to view the novel as a genuine art form. So, reluctance means not willing to do something. Not willing to what? Not willing to view the novel as a genuine art form. So, he is not really willing to see the novel as a genuine art form. So, his text was written in part as a direct response to a lecture and pamphlet of the same title by the novelist and critic Walter Besant. So again, just in the fashion, the way we have seen that various critics right from the classical age have written their essays on criticism as response to some other essays which have been written, a kind of expressing some other beliefs. Similarly, here also, he, that is Henry James, put forward his views on the genre of novel in the essay The Art of Fiction as a response to what? To the writing, the lecture and pamphlet of the same title by the novelist and critic Walter Besant. So this is the context based on which this particular essay, The Art of Fiction, was written. James is concerned to establish the novel as a serious art form rather than as merely an amusing or escapist pastime. So he was really bothered about the fact that novel is not taken up or considered as a serious art form. So he wanted to establish the novel as a serious art form rather than as merely an amusing or escapist pastime. So he didn't want the novel art form to be just a kind of pastime, right? Just an amusement or something as a way to escape or to pass time just for entertainment. So this is what he was trying to talk. He wanted to elevate the status of novels and wanted to provide novel with the status of genuine art form and not just a piece of literature developed for pastime or developed for entertainment. So this was his first kind of debate which he point in the debate. Secondly, while he applauds Besant's attempt to foster the serious treatment of fiction, he disputes Besant's assumptions that rules can be somehow prescribed for fiction. So what does he dispute? He disputes that Besant's assumptions that rules can be somehow prescribed. Rules can be prescribed for what? For fiction. So as we know that he is writing against what Besant had written. So what is he doing? He is actually kind of, taking up the next point wherein he is saying that he is kind of against, he disputes Besant's assumption that rules can be prescribed for fiction because he feels that you cannot put across any rules as to how fiction should be written. So James's central claim is that the novelist and the novel must be free. So free in the sense you cannot tie them down to any particular rule. So he was against any specific rules being designed as to how fiction should be written. So he was against this assumption. His central claim is that novelist and the novel must be free. And it is in reaction to Besant's ideas, wherein he was talking about some kind of rules which he felt could be made in order to prescribe it, that is, give it to the future people who are writing fiction. Finally, James is highly conscious of a puritanical environment which views art as having an injurious effect and opposed to morality, amusement, or instruction. So he was very aware of what? Aware of the puritanical environment. And because of puritanical environment, morality, amusement, instruction, so these were given more importance. Right? So henceforth, James, novelistic freedom entails also a liberation from moral and educational requirements and constraints. Entails what? Also a liberation from moral, educational requirements and constraints. That is the way you tie it down, right? So he is saying that novelistic freedom should be such. It is liberated, that is, it is free from any kind of moral or educational obligation. While James's central thesis is that the novel must be free, its freedom is first worked out in relation to the kind of novelistic realism on which James insists. The only reason for the existence of a novel is that it does not attempt to represent life. As the picture is real, so the novel is history. So, novel must be free. Its freedom is first worked out in relation to the kind of novelistic realism on which James insists. So, he is saying that the novel does not attempt, or that it does attempt to represent life as the picture is reality, so the novel is history. So, talking about realism. In attempting to represent life, the novelist's task is analogous with that of the painter, like the painter. In search for truth, the novelistic art is analogous with philosophy as well as history. The double analogy, says James, is a magnificent heritage. So he is making comparison of the very process of writing a novel with other art forms. James suggests as a broad definition of the genre that novel is a personal, a direct impression of life. So, what is novel? Novel is a personal, direct impression of life, and it is successful in as much as it reveals a particular and unique mind of a particular individual. Hence, the procedure of artistic realism cannot be prescribed. So, he is saying that we cannot prescribe, we cannot say that how realism is actually going to be like. Because a novel is a personal, a direct impression of life. And through that process, what does it do? It reveals, that is, it shows something. What does it show? It reveals a particular and unique mind. So it reveals what? It reveals a particular and unique mind. And we know that any human being's mind cannot be the same, it has to be different. Hence, the procedure of artistic realism cannot be prescribed because it is revealing an individual's mind, and nobody's mind can be same. He is effectively disputing Besant's claim that the laws of fiction may be laid down and taught with precision and exactness. So, laws of fiction may be laid down and taught with precision and exactness. Who is saying? Besant is saying. And we know that James was actually going against Besant's ideas. Moreover, the enterprise of realism is vastly complex. The writer should indeed possess a sense of reality. But reality has a myriad forms and cannot be encompassed within some formula. So, the enterprise of realism is vastly complex. It is not really very simple, it is complex. And the writer should indeed possess a sense of reality, but reality has a myriad forms and cannot be encompassed within some formula. So, as we discussed, that reality has different versions. Reality is like an iceberg wherein You're seeing the iceberg from one direction, you see one part of it. Somebody seeing it from the other direction will see some other part of it. And then some part of it will be submerged underwater. So the underwater animals will see it in some way. The people above the water will see it in some way. So this is how the idea of realism is complex. If this is an iceberg, this particular the triangular figure, then the way we are going to project about it or speak about it will be different for different observers, depending on from where you are observing, what you are observing, what is your main idea and your impression. So that is what they are trying to say. It possesses a sense of reality, but reality has a myriad forms, that is many forms, and cannot be encompassed within some specific formula. Next is Matthew Arnold. So we just discussed about Henry James, and James's main ideas we have discussed, and how he is talking about the novel as a form, its significance, why novel as a form should be given importance, and it should not be just thought of as a source for escape or as a source for entertainment. Rather, it should be a process, or it should be an idea of representing some kind of, you know, reality, wherein that reality is the reality which is a part of your mind. With this, we move on to the next thought thinker, Matthew Arnold. It is said that when the poet in Arnold died, the critic was born. So Matthew Arnold, all of you have read his poetry. He's a very, very well-known poet. And it is said that when the poet in Arnold died, the critic was born. And it is true that from this time onward, he turned almost entirely to prose. So he was a poet, but then he had this flair for criticism, and as he became a critic, criticism was born, his flair for poetry died, and he was now writing prose. Some of the leading ideas and phrases were early put into currency in essays in criticism and culture and anarchy. The first essay in the 1865 volume, that is Essays in Criticism, is The Function of Criticism at the Present Time. It is an overture announcing briefly most of the themes he developed more fully in later work. It is at once evident that he ascribes to criticism, what does he ascribe? A scope and importance hitherto undreamed of. So he ascribes to criticism a scope and importance which is hitherto undreamed of. Function of criticism, in his sense, is a disinterested endeavor, that is, not interested, a disinterested endeavor or desire to do what? To learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world, and thus to establish a current of fresh and true ideas. So, the function of criticism, in his sense, is what? A disinterested endeavor. That is a desire, an approach to learn and propagate. That is, learn something and spread that thing. What? The best that is known and thought in the world. So whatever is the best that is known and thought in the world, that is what is propagated. And thus, to establish a current of fresh and true ideas. So, establish a current of fresh and true ideas. It is in fact a spirit that he is trying to foster, the spirit of an awakened and informed intelligence, playing upon not literature merely, but theology, history, art, science, sociology, and politics. And in every sphere, seeking to see the object as in itself it really is. So, trying to see the object as in itself it really is. So, establish a current, fresh, and true ideas and see the best that is known and thought in the world. And that is a disinterested endeavor, a desire to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. The English literary critic must know literatures other than his own and be in touch with European standards. So, according to Matthew Arnold, other literatures, that is, literatures other than English literature or the English literature writers, he felt the others of different other languages, they were in touch with European standards, that is, other standards, and hence he is saying that the English literary critics, the English literary writer should also know literatures other than his own and be in touch with European, the other languages which are spoken in Europe. So, those standards. The last line of thought Arnold develops in the second essay, the literary influence of academies, in which he dwells upon the note of provinciality in English literature, caused by remoteness from a center of correct knowledge and correct taste. So, he dwells upon the note of provinciality and in English literature caused by remoteness from a center of correct knowledge and correct taste. So, he wanted the English literary critic to know and be in touch with other European standards. The first essay in 1888 volume, The Study of Poetry, was originally published as the general introduction to T.H. Ward's anthology, The English Poets. So, the first essay in the 1888 volume, The Study of Poetry, was published as the general introduction to T.H. Ward's anthology, The English Poets. It contains many of the ideas for which Arnold is best remembered. In an age of crumbling creeds, that is when religion was crumbling down, science was seeping in, poetry will have to replace religion. So, Arnold was trying to say that poetry needs to replace religion in an age, so in the Victorian age, when the religion was crumbling down and poetry had a greater role to replace it. More and more, we will turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. Therefore, we must know how to distinguish the best poetry from the inferior. So, he is trying to do something, and that is, he is trying to say that how we are going to differentiate, how we are going to identify the best poetry and how we should identify which is the inferior poetry. And that is by turn to poetry to interpret life for us. When poetry tries to interpret life for us, to console us and to sustain us, that is when it how we can distinguish what is best and what is worst, the genuine from the counterfeit, that is the false one. So differentiating the genuine from the false, and to do this we must steep ourselves in the work of the acknowledged meter or masters, using as touchstones passages exemplifying their high seriousness and their superiority of diction and movement. Now, dear students, this method is known as the touchstone method. Touchstone, in the sense, refers to what? refers to those examples of poetry from different writers of poetry whose poetry can be marked as examples of best poetry, and the passages which can exemplify high seriousness and their superiority of diction and movement, right? So those touchstones or those specific examples from literature can actually be samples which can be followed. That is, they can be touchstones which can be followed in future. The remaining essays, with the exception of the last two on Tolstoy and Emile, all deal with English poets, that is Milton, Gray, Keats, Wordsworth, Byron, and Shelley. All contain memorable things and all attempt a serious and responsible assessment of each poet's criticism of life and his value as food for the modern spirit. So, all contain what? Memorable things, and all attempt a serious and responsible assessment of each poet's criticism of life and his value as food for the modern spirit. So he considers some of the texts which are written by some literary critics earlier as the best examples. However, he has been taken to task, that is, he has been criticized for some of his judgments and omissions. For example, for his judgment that Dryden and Pope were not genuine poets because they composed in their wits instead of in the soul. So he said that Dryden and Pope are not genuine poets. Why? Because they were using their wits instead of their soul. For calling Gray a minor classic in an age of prose and spiritual bleakness, for paying too much attention to the man behind the poetry, Gray, Keats, Shelley, for making no mention of Donne, and above all for saying that poetry is at bottom a criticism of life. So for all these things, he had to face some backlash, some criticism. And it is common for any kind of critic, for any kind of work, that there will be instances of criticism. So Arnold also could not escape that. His idea of selecting certain works as touchstones and rejecting certain works were criticized. Culture and Anarchy is in some ways Arnold's most central work. It is an expansion of his earlier attacks in The Function of Criticism and Heinrich Heine upon the smugness, Philistinism, that is the attitude or quality of not caring about or understanding or liking good art, music or literature, and mammon, that is wealth regarded as an evil, worshipping wealth, worship of Victorian England. So he was in Culture and Anarchy, as the name, the title itself suggests. It is a take on the culture of the Victorian England. And he talks about culture as the study of perfection is opposed to the prevalent anarchy of a new democracy without standards and without a sense of direction. By turning a stream of fresh thought upon our stock notions and habits, culture seeks to make reason and the will of God prevail. So, what happens? Culture seeks to make reason and the will of God to prevail. That is the positivity to prevail. This classification of English society is also significant. So Arnold's classification of English society into barbarians with their high spirit, serenity, and distinguished manners, and their inaccessibility to ideas. Then, number one, barbarians. Number two, is the idea of Philistines. Philistines, the stronghold of religious non-conformity with plenty of energy and morality but insufficient sweetness and light. And the populace, still raw and blind, is well known. So, what is well known? Arnold's division of the society. And division of the society in what way? Division of the society in the form of three categories or classification of the idea of how the English society was during the Victorian age, wherein he kind of discussed how there can be one class termed as the barbarians, which with their high spirit, who have high spirit, serenity, and distinguished manners, and their inaccessibility to ideas. Next, being Philistines, the stronghold of religious non-conformity, so not non-conformity to religion, with plenty of energy and morality, but insufficient sweetness and light. And the next category is of the populace, that is still raw and blind. So, these are certain categories which he has done in his book, The Culture and Anarchy. So, Arnold saw in the Philistines the key to the whole positions. They are now the most influential section of the society. Who? The Philistines. Their strength was the nation's strength, their crudeness, its crudeness. Educate and humanize the Philistines, therefore. Arnold saw in the idea of the state and not in any one class of the society the true organ and repository of the nation's collective, that is the best self. So, what did he see? He saw the idea of the state not in one class of society, the true organ and repository of the nation's collective, best self. So, he talks about these categories, how the society is divided, and how his idea of state is not in any one class of the society, the true organ and the repository of the nation's collective best self. That is what he wants to say. So, with this, we discussed Arnold and Matthew Arnold's touchstone, the idea of touchstone, then identifying certain characters of certain writers, and basically identifying certain writers as the epitome of perfection, and hence it kind of entailing them or providing them with the value of kind of being able to provide with guidelines to the later generation writers is seen in many cases. And the backlash which he had to face is also a truth. And it is also a truth that he is still well known for this particular focus of his. Right. So his idea of culture and anarchy, his idea of dividing the society into different classes as per his understanding, and identifying the idea of the state is also significant. But from the literary criticism point of view, the writers whom he had identified as the very good writers, who could be considered as examples, as the touchstones, you need to know about them. And the ones whom he had not considered, who were left out, who were they? and which was the book in which this particular idea he had put, or which was the essay in which he had put this idea. So what is the origin of these ideas, you need to prepare, right? So with this, we come to a fresh new thinker, theorist, critic, as you must or you may say, Mikhail Bakhtin. So Bakhtin can be read in your literary theory syllabus as well as he can be applicable in literary criticism. Since we have not taken up Bakhtin when we were doing literary theory, I took him up for discussion for today's session on literary criticism. Right. So, Mikhail Bakhtin is a very well-known name, and his examples, his theory, his ideas can be applicable to texts not only which were written when he was writing as a critic, but it can be applicable to the works, or rather it can be applicable to the ideas which have come before him. For example, when I was in my PG, when I was doing my post graduation, in our project, we applied Mikhail Bakhtin's ideas in uh, Chaucer's texts. So, if we talk about the origin of English and the way English originated and the Canterbury Tales, then we applied, or rather, it was my personal project, wherein I applied his concepts of uh, literary criticism, or his theory, into reading of the Canterbury Tales, wherein we can hear or we can see different voices coming up and speaking to us, which in itself is something interesting. And as I was saying, that it is not only that we are going to apply Bakhtin in any contemporary texts, but if we take texts from the previous days, then also we can do that. So, Mikhail M. Bakhtin is increasingly being recognized as one of the major literary theorists of the 20th century. So, he was one of the significant literary theorists, and as I said, that you can read him in theory as well as while reading criticism. Now, since we just discussed the Victorian critics, after that, as Bakhtin comes, somewhere during this line, we are reading him or having an understanding of his concepts. He is perhaps best known for his radical philosophy of language. So his philosophy was based on radical philosophy of language, as well as his theory of the novel, underpinned by concepts such as dialogism, polyphony, carnivalesque, themselves resting on the more fundamental concept of heteroglossia. So you should actually read all these terms which are given over here. Okay, like what is dialogism, what is polyphony, what is carnival, and what are their implications. So, when we read Bakhtin, the idea of language and how language plays and how different voices can be heard in language comes up. And the concept of carnivalesque is a literary mode that subverts and liberates the assumptions of the dominant style or atmosphere through humor and chaos. So, this idea of carnivalesque actually originated as carnival in Bakhtin's Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics and was further developed in Rabelais and his world. So, for Bakhtin, carnival, that is the totality of popular festivities, rituals, and other carnival forms, is deeply rooted in the human psyche on both the collective and individual level. So, this carnival or carnivalesque relies on the things and ideas which are deeply rooted in our human psyche related to different festivities, rituals, and carnivals. So, though historically it is really complex and it's kind of varied, it has over time worked out an entire language of symbolic, concretely sensuous forms which express a unified carnival sense of the world permeating all its forms. So, he talks about the fact that, the language cannot be adequately verbalized or translated into abstract concepts, but it is amenable to a transportation into an artistic language that resonates with its actual kind of, ideas and with its essential qualities. So, in other words, be transposed into language of literature. So, this transportation, the carnivalization of literature, this is what Bakhtin calls this transportation as the carnivalization of literature. Although he considers a number of literary forms and individual writers, it is Rabelais, the French Renaissance author of Gargantua and Pantagruel, and the 19th century Russian author Dostoevsky that he considers the primary examples of carnivalization in literature. So this goes to the idea of carnival or carnivalesque, which you need to prepare along with heteroglossia, dialogism, and polyphony. When we are saying polyphony, we can understand it is poly means many, and it is talking about different voices which come out of a particular text. So Bakhtin's writings were produced at a time of momentous upheavals. So at a time of momentous upheaval of what? Momentous upheaval in Russia. The revolution of 1917 was followed by a civil war, that is 1918 to 1921, famine, and dark years of repressive dictatorship under Joseph Stalin. So, this is what is kind of gets projection through the various techniques which Bakhtin had introduced. The major works as translated into English of Bakhtin includes Art and Answerability, Early Philosophical Essays, Rabelais and His World, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, as we were saying right now, I was discussing regarding the concept of carnivalesque, and regarding the carnivalesque as we were discussing, the Dialogic Imagination, 4 essays which we are going to discuss now, and speech genres and other late essays which we are going to discuss now. These were about dialogism. These were about the idea of, the heteroglossia, and talking about carnivalesque. He was talking about the idea of carnival, about the different images which are there in our mind already, how language kind of transports that, and the transportation of language, how it brings about the idea of carnivalesque. So, heteroglossia. So, we can break down any single national language into a social. So, heteroglossia, it quickly becomes apparent that Bakhtin's view, that is Bakhtin's idea of the novel, is dependent upon his broader view of the nature of language as dialogic. So dialogic and as comprised of heteroglossia. Now these concept of dialogic and the concept of heteroglossia are actually interlinked. So in order to explain the concept of dialogism, we first need to understand the term heteroglossia. So heteroglossia refers to the circumstance that what we usually think of as a single unitary language is actually comprised of a multiplicity of languages. Just the way polyphony was talking about different voices, more voices, he is talking about multiplicity of languages interacting with and often ideologically competing with one another. So, in Bakhtin's terms, any given language is actually stratified into several other languages. And hence, heteroglossia might be translated as other languageness. So, what can be the term we can use for heteroglossia? The term which can be used is also as other languageness. So, heteroglossia talks about the way in which an unitary language is also comprised of multiplicity of languages interacting with and often ideologically competing with. That is, the ideology of that particular language, that particular context is competing with one another. And hence, he is talking about the term heteroglossia, which is other languageness. Right? Then, the example of this we can see in this slide. For example, we can break down any single national language into social dialects, characteristic group behavior, professional jargons, that is the slang language, that is the difficult kind of language which we use. There are different professional, the specific languages which are kind of used for that also. So there are jargons, there are slangs which are used for particular context. Then there are generic languages and languages of generations and age groups. So languages of the authorities of various circles of passing fashions. So each day has its own slogan, its own vocabulary, its own emphasis. So it is this heteroglossia, says Bakhtin, which is indispensable prerequisite for the novel as a genre. So this heteroglossia needs to be included because no language is uniform. There are different strands to it. There are different parts to it. There are different versions of it. And it can be broken down into various dialects, into different jargons, into various generic languages, which contribute to the idea of heteroglossia, wherein it refers to the fact that a single or unitary language is actually comprised of multiplicity of languages which are interacting with and often ideologically competent with one another. So this is what heteroglossia is talking about. And as we were discussing, heteroglossia is related to the other idea, which is dialogism. So dialogism refers to the fact that various languages that stratify any single language are in dialogue with one another. So, refers to the fact that various languages that stratify any single language are in dialogue with one another. Bakhtin calls this primordial dialogism of discourse, whereby all discourse has a dialogic orientation. We might illustrate this using the following example. The language of religious discourse does not exist in a state of ideological and linguistic neutrality. On the contrary, such discourse might act as a rejoinder or reply to elements of political discourse. So, any language of religious discourse. Now, discourse we have discussed when we were discussing Foucault. The idea of discourse, what is considered as discourse. So, it's the people in power who decide what is considered as a discourse. So religious discourse is decided by the people who are in power in respect to religion or that particular religious institution. The ideological state apparatus, whatever we have discussed in Marxism, you can refer to that. So Bakhtin's thoughts and ideologies sometimes kind of get associated with psychology, with the study of language, and also the idea of Marxism. So religious discourse, such discourse might act as a rejoinder to some kind of political discourse, so some kind of reply to it, some kind of reaction to it. So the idea that various languages that stratify any single language are in dialogue with one another. So it's not that that particular dialogue, that particular discourse, that particular language is existing in vacuum. Rather, the situation is that it is always in constant equation with certain other discourses which are also existing in that particular loop. So, calls this primordial dialogism of discourse, whereby all discourse has a dialogic orientation. So all the discourses are having a dialogic, or it's in reply to something, it's in a kind of relation to something. So always there is a kind of communication which is happening. So this is what he talks about in dialogism. Even a work of art does not come from the brain of its author, speaking a single monologic language. It is a response, a rejoinder to other works, to certain traditions, and it situates itself within a current of intersecting dialogues. So its relation to other works of art and to other languages, that is literary and non-literary, is dialogic. So what is dialogic? The idea of relation to what? To other works of art, to other languages, to that language or that work of art might be literary, it might be non-literary. So this equation makes it dialogic. So as you can understand, dialogism is about the fact how a particular text which is written, if you are writing, for example, this particular text, how this particular text which is written is having a relation with some other particular text which has been written at some point of time. It might be the text which is written prior to it, it might be a text which is written after it. But this equation which is shared by these two texts, that is what gives birth to the idea of dialogism. So speaking a single monologic language, it is a response or rejoinder to other works, to certain traditions, and it situates itself within a current of intersecting dialogues. It cannot or it does not come out as a work of art from the brain of the author directly. So he is talking about the historical background, the context based on which a text is written, and how we saw that, as we were reading various essays of different critics, how they were writing in response to other, writers and other critics. So that is what dialogism is kind of doing. It is actually talking about the intersections, how it is born, dialogues or other works are born at the center of the intersection of different dialogues which are already existing, and the text kind of adds on. It is an addition to some kind of debate which is already going on. If you take up a post-colonial novel, it is a rejoinder, it's a kind of response, it is a kind of taking forward of that particular theory for the later writers, his own observation based on his understanding and whatever he wishes to analyze and add to the discussion which is already going on. So, according to Bakhtin, a particular text cannot take birth in the brain of that particular author being secluded from the external forces. It will always be influenced by the other external responses. So, single monologic language is a response, a rejoinder to other works, to certain traditions, and it situates itself within a current of intersecting dialogues in relation to other works of art and to other languages. Is that particular text, that particular work, its relation makes it dialogic. Now we are here at the end of the presentation, and the idea and the chapter on the literary criticism. However, the topic of I.A. Richards is significant, and you can actually kind of read uh, uh, T.S. Eliot, whom we have already discussed. If time would permit, we could have taken up T.S. Eliot, and you could have discussed Eliot for literary criticism. But since we don't have time, we won't be discussing him. What I would suggest you is that you refer back to the literary theory, the any kind of PPT or the lecture series which has already been there, wherein I have taken up T.S. Eliot when we are discussing new criticism and new critics for literary theory. That is the very first part of literary theory, wherein his idea of objective correlative and the various concepts which he gave birth to are important and significant for literary criticism as well. Now, some students in the previous session were asking for certain important books. So you can actually refer to I.A. Richards' practical criticism. So you can refer to Richards' practical criticism, this book, wherein you will get some idea regarding criticism. And then William Empson's 7 types of ambiguity. So what do we mean by ambiguity and 7 types of ambiguity? And then F.R. Lewis, The Great Tradition. So next is F.R. Lewis, The Great Tradition. Another important work which you can refer to is M.H. Abrams. M.H. Abrams. M.H. Abrams, The Mirror and the Lamp. Then Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism. You can also refer to Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, whom I have referred to when we were doing post-colonialism, and her concept of subaltern studies and the position of women. So, in other words, essay in cultural politics. Then regarding feminism and the discourse of feminism, you can talk about Sandra M. Gilbert and Susan Guber's The Mad Woman in the Attic. And in general, any kind of book on criticism, which is going to be kind of helpful, you can refer to. There is one book by B. Das and J. M. Mohanty on literary criticism published by Oxford, which is also interesting. Though I. Richards' Practical Criticism and Abrams' book is interesting, which you can refer to for your further studies. There is one book by Terry Eagleton, which I have already referred to when I was referring to your, having the lecture on the literary theory. You can refer to that book as well. And Norton Anthology on Theory on Criticism. So you can even refer to the Norton Anthology. And in general, any kind of book which you have on literary terms. So literary terms books can be referred to, because if you refer to the literary terms books, then in that you are going to get what will happen is that you will get the so there is Oxford's book on literary terms, And there are various other books on literary terms which you can actually see, which will help you to get an analysis and idea of different kinds of terms which are there, which can be utilized for any, an comprehensive reading regarding the entire study of English net set. Because if you read that particular literary terms book, you will get different kinds of expressions and analysis of different small, short ideas which perhaps might not be covered in general. So I hope these discussion will be helpful for you. So with this, I would be kind of concluding today's lecture. If you have any question, you can put up in the chat box. If not, then we can call it a day. So, literary criticism, literary theory, what is literature, and how analysis of literature can be enhanced through the different theories and the practical application of theories in the form of literary criticism is what we have discussed through these different lectures. Hopefully, it will really help you to have the basic understanding of the concepts of literary criticism. Along with it, it will in general help you to be a better reader, a better analyzer, a better critic of literary texts. So as you go ahead with reading more for your NetSet English, you can use this database for further scientific and much better, critical analysis of the texts from different perspectives, which we can do. So with these words, I will call it a day. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.